This is Samuel, and he was the man who in a single dawn saw a lifetime's work turned to dust and mud by the treads of a tractor. His beehives, which he treated as sanctuaries, were crushed not by accident, but by the direct order of a man whose power came from the land, but whose soul was barren. It was an act of pure arrogance, a message that the faith and patience of a simple man were worthless in the face of greed, a cold and calculated humiliation. Has your faith ever been tested to the point of seeing what you love most ground up and thrown in a ditch? Before I tell you how God acted in his life, after evil destroyed his livelihood, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place such a great injustice in his hands. The tension in the valley had been thick enough to cut with a knife for months. On one side, Samuel's small property, a piece of land inherited from his father, where every plant had a name and every bee was treated as a divine messenger. On the other, the vast estate of Colonel Valdemar, a sea of soybeans that expanded year after year, swallowing up the small farms with the hunger of a metal giant. Valdemar, a white man with a deep voice and broad gestures, didn't see the valley. He saw a profit spreadsheet, and Samuel, with his black skin, his calloused hands, and his silent faith, was just an obstacle, a small stone in his expensive leather shoe. The conflict erupted. On a hot afternoon, under a punishing sun, the colonel went personally to the fence that divided the two worlds. He didn't greet, didn't ask for permission. He just pointed with his chin to the dozens of colored wooden boxes from which came the soft, constant buzzing that was the background music of Samuel's life. "Get these boxes out of here," he ordered, with the voice of someone who doesn't expect a no. "Your pests are getting in my men's way when they're applying the poison. Besides, they're useless for my crops." Samuel felt the contempt in those words, the ignorance that called the most delicate work of God's creation a pest. With the calm that so irritated the impatient, Samuel tried to explain. He spoke of pollination, of how his little workers, as he called them, were vital not only for his flowers, but for the entire balance of the valley. He explained that without them, many plants would simply stop bearing fruit. Valdemar laughed, a dry, joyless sound. To him, Samuel's explanation sounded like a superstition, a weak man's excuse for not obeying an order. "Stop with the nonsense, Samuel. Either you remove this the easy way, or I'll take care of it myself." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real as the smell of dust rising from the road. Samuel did not move a single hive, not out of defiance but out of principle. That land was his, a sacred right. The bees were not objects. They were part of his family, his faith. He spent the rest of the day in prayer, not asking God to punish the colonel, but to give him the wisdom and strength to endure what was to come. His daughter, Helena, a 16-year-old with the fire of justice in her eyes, didn't understand. "Father, he humiliated you. Aren't you going to do anything? Call the police, report him?" Samuel just hugged her, feeling the stiffness of anger in the girl's shoulders, and said, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, my daughter. Let's trust." Valdemar's response came in the dead of night. Samuel awoke not to a noise but to the silence that followed it, the distant muffled sound of a heavy engine that he, in his light sleep, thought was a truck on the road. But when day broke, a void in the air made him get out of bed with a tightness in his chest. The constant buzzing, the melody of his life, had disappeared. He walked to the edge of his land, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The colorful boxes were in pieces, crushed, mixed with the churned-up earth. Golden honey ran over the ground, forming dirty puddles where dying bees struggled in their final moments. A sea of destruction. It was as if a metal beast had chewed up his sanctuary and spat out the remains. This was not just a financial loss, it was a desecration. Every one of those boxes had been assembled by his own hands. He knew each colony, the strength of each queen. It was years of work, of dedication, of silent conversations with God amidst the buzzing of his creatures. All annihilated in a few minutes of blind fury. Helena came running right behind him, and the cry of pain and anger she let out echoed through the silent valley. She fell to her knees, crying, punching the earth with her fists. The neighbors began to appear, drawn by the girl's cry. They looked at the scene with a mixture of pity, indignation, and fear. They knew who had done it, but the colonel's name was too heavy to be spoken aloud. They offered words of comfort, but their eyes shifted away, afraid that Valdemar's wrath might splash onto them. In that moment, Samuel felt the deepest loneliness, the pain of loss, the public humiliation, and the silent fear of his own brothers in faith. It was a test that seemed too great to bear. While Helena cried and the neighbors whispered, Samuel remained standing, motionless, looking at the carnage. A hollow pain settled in his chest, a chill that ran up his spine. For a moment, doubt assailed him. Where was God in this scene of death? Why did he allow evil to win so overwhelmingly? Anger, an emotion he rarely felt, began to bubble under his skin. But then, he remembered a conversation with his late wife years ago, when a drought almost destroyed everything. She had said, "Faith is not the absence of the storm, but the certainty that the ark will float." With this memory warming his heart, something changed inside Samuel. He walked slowly through the wreckage, ignoring the sticky honey on his boots. He reached the center of the destruction, where his oldest and strongest hive used to be. And there, to everyone's astonishment, he knelt, not to mourn, but to pray. Helena stopped crying, looking at her father in disbelief. The colonel's henchmen, who were watching from a distance to ensure the lesson had been learned, glanced at each other, confused. They expected shouts, curses, threats. They did not expect a black man on his knees, amidst the ruin of his life, speaking with God. Samuel's voice was not one of supplication, but of surrender. Low, firm, cutting through the heavy morning air. "Father, forgive him, for he does not understand the work of your hands," he said, with his eyes closed, his hands spread on the honey-soiled earth. "I lay this pain and this injustice on your altar. May your justice be done in your time and in your way." There was no hatred in his voice, no desire for revenge. There was a peace that defied the logic of the situation, a strength that did not come from him but passed through him. The neighbors fell silent. The colonel's henchmen took a step back as if they had touched something sacred and dangerous. The silence that followed his prayer was deeper than the silence left by the dead bees. Helena looked at her father with a mixture of love and desperation. She wanted him to scream, to fight, to show the fury she herself felt boiling in her chest. Seeing her father on his knees, forgiving the man who had destroyed them, was almost more painful than the destruction itself. It seemed like weakness, a surrender. "Father," she whispered. Her voice choked, but she couldn't complete the sentence. At that moment, she did not understand that Samuel's strength was not in striking back, but in having enough faith to absorb the blow, trusting that a greater power would handle the response. Her youthful revolt crashed against the wall of her father's unshakable faith. The scene of the man praying amidst his own ruin spread through the valley like wildfire. For the small church community, it was a living testimony, a lesson of faith that would be told for years. But for Valdemar's men, it was a bad omen. They returned to the farm headquarters in silence, the arrogance of a completed mission replaced by a strange restlessness. They were brutish men, accustomed to the violence of the land and of men, but Samuel's calm had disarmed them. There was something in that gesture, in that prayer, that their boss's money couldn't buy nor the force of their tractors could crush. A respectful fear began to sprout in their hearts. In the days that followed, Samuel did not stand still, waiting for a miracle to fall from the sky. His faith was active. With the help of Helena, who gradually exchanged anger for resignation, he began the painstaking work of cleaning up the mess. He gathered the pieces of broken wood, buried the dead bees in a trench, scraped the honey from the earth. Each gesture was both a farewell and an act of resilience. It was slow, sticky, and painful work, a practical mourning. The church community, seeing his attitude, mobilized. They brought food, helped with the cleanup, offered words of comfort. Samuel's pain had become a catalyst, uniting those people in a way no sermon could. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, arrogance flourished, literally. Colonel Valdemar's vast soybean plantations exploded into a sea of white and purplish flowers. The crop was more beautiful than ever, promising a record harvest. Valdemar would drive by in his truck, kicking up dust, and look with disdain at Samuel's cleared plot, where now only bare earth remained. For him, it was the final proof of his victory. Nature, with its logic of strength and productivity, seemed to be on his side. He had eliminated the pest and would now reap the fruits of his decision. The world seemed to confirm that power and money always win. Valdemar's pride was such that he made a point of humiliating Samuel whenever he could. One morning, seeing Samuel mending the fence, he stopped his truck and shouted with a scornful smile, "So, Samuel, have you talked to God today? It seems he's busier blessing my land than listening to your prayers." The provocation was cruel, calculated to hurt where it hurt the most. Samuel just raised his eyes, met the colonel's gaze for an instant, and without a word, returned to his work. That silence, that lack of reaction, was more irritating to Valdemar than any response. He wanted to see Samuel broken, but all he found was a serenity he couldn't comprehend. It was then that the first sign appeared, subtle, almost imperceptible. A strange silence began to hang over Valdemar's flowering fields. At first, no one paid it any mind, but as the days passed, the silence became denser, more present. The workers, accustomed to the constant buzz of insects during flowering, began to notice. There was no sound of honeybees, bumblebees, not even small wasps. The air over that sea of flowers was dead. It was like looking at a beautiful but lifeless painting. Samuel, from his property, also noticed. He knew the sounds of the earth, and that silence was unnatural. It was the sound of emptiness. The weeks dragged on, and the beauty of the flowers began to turn macabre. They opened, lush and full of pollen, but nothing happened. No insects visited them. The delicate petals, which should have given way to small green pods, simply withered, dried, and fell to the ground, forming a sad and useless carpet. The promise of a record harvest was dissolving into thin air. The field, once a symbol of prosperity, was now a vast cemetery of sterile flowers. Nature, which Valdemar thought he had tamed, was giving him a silent and devastating answer. The direct consequence of his act of destruction was manifesting itself. Valdemar at first refused to believe it. His arrogance turned into denial. He blamed an alleged invisible pest, the quality of the seeds, the weather. He hired the best agronomists in the region who came, analyzed the soil, the plants, and found no logical explanation. The conditions were perfect. The land was fertile. The rain had come at the right time. There was no disease, no fungus. The science of men, with all its charts and chemical analyses, could not explain the failure. They looked at the falling flowers and scratched their heads, defeated by a problem they could not see or measure. It was the colonel's workers, the simple men of the countryside, who first gave a name to what was happening. They remembered the day the tractors crushed the hives. They remembered Samuel's prayer. Among themselves, in low voices, far from the boss's ears, the word began to spread. It's a punishment. It wasn't a technical analysis, it was a certainty that came from the soul. God has called in the debt, said one. The man messed with God's little creatures, and now the earth refuses to bear fruit, whispered another. The fear they once had of Valdemar was transforming into a reverent awe for the silent justice they were witnessing. With each passing day, Valdemar's plantation became a more desolate spectacle. The stalks that should have been heavy with pods remained upright and empty, like green skeletons against the blue sky. The vibrant green of the crop began to give way to a yellowish, sickly hue. The ruin did not come like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, incurable disease. Valdemar would walk among the rows of soy, touching the dry plants, the disbelief on his face slowly turning to panic. All his investment, all his planning, all his certainty of control were disintegrating before his eyes, turning to dust. Nature was charging him a price his money couldn't pay. On the other side of the fence, life followed a different rhythm. Samuel's small property was not a sea of monoculture. He had his vegetables, his fruit trees, and the wildflowers he always let grow on the edges. And to these few flowers, the rare bees that survived the massacre, or that came from farther away, began to appear. They were few, a timid buzz compared to the symphony he had lost, but it was a sound of life. Small tomatoes began to sprout, the pumpkins flowered and set fruit. Life, though wounded, insisted on continuing on his small piece of land. It was a brutal contrast to the colonel's sterile desert. Helena watched everything in silence. The anger she had felt at the beginning had been replaced by a profound astonishment. She saw the neighbor's harvest wither and her father's small garden flourish. She understood now. The justice she had wanted with police and reports would have been loud and, perhaps, ineffective. But the justice that was unfolding before her eyes was silent, undeniable, and terrifying in its precision. It was creation itself responding to the aggression. She looked at her father, who continued his daily work with the same serenity as always, and finally understood the depth of his faith. It was not passivity, it was an absolute trust in the power and timing of God. Valdemar's desperation reached its peak when the banks and suppliers started calling. The news of the lost harvest spread, and the easy credit he had always enjoyed began to dry up. He, who had always seen himself as a king in his fiefdom, was now seen as a bad manager, a man who had lost his touch. His arrogance had blinded him to the interdependence of things. He tried everything. He bought boxes and boxes of bees from other states, but it was too late. The flowers had already fallen. The pollination window had closed. He had destroyed an army of free workers, only to later try, in vain, to buy a handful of mercenaries. The colonel's humiliation became public. The same neighbors who once feared him now looked at him with a mixture of pity and a poorly disguised satisfaction. The man who thought himself a god on his lands was demoted to a fool, defeated not by a powerful rival, but by the silence of an insect. His fall was the main story in every conversation circle, in every bar, in every Sunday service. The story of Samuel and the bees became a modern parable, a living testimony that there are forces that cannot be controlled by brute force or money. Valdemar's power, built on intimidation, crumbled when the foundation of his wealth dried up. It was on a grey afternoon, with the smell of rain in the air, that the unthinkable happened. Valdemar's truck stopped at Samuel's gate, but this time there was no arrogance. The door opened and out stepped an aged man, his shoulders stooped by the weight of defeat. He did not shout, did not give orders. He walked slowly to Samuel, who was sitting on the porch, reading his Bible. The colonel stopped a few feet away, the fence still between them, like a symbol of the barrier he himself had created. He looked at Samuel, then at the dry fields in the distance, and then back at Samuel. The silence between the two men was thick, laden with months of tension, injustice, and now a complete reversal of power. Valdemar opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? To apologize seemed too small. To try to justify himself would be pathetic. For the first time in his life, the man accustomed to having all the answers was completely lost. His eyes, once sparkling with authority, were now dull, empty. He was a deposed king, standing before the only subject who had never bowed, not out of defiance, but because he served. A greater king. Finally, with a hoarse, broken voice, he asked the only question he had left. It wasn't a request for forgiveness, but a plea for understanding. "What happened, Samuel?" he asked, the colonel gone from his posture. It was just Valdemar, a ruined farmer, asking a humble beekeeper about the mysteries of creation. The question wasn't just about the soybeans. It was about everything. About power, about faith, about the order of things he thought he understood. And now saw he understood nothing at all. He wasn't seeking a solution, but perhaps an absolution, an explanation that could calm the chaos in his soul. Samuel closed his Bible calmly, marking the page with his finger. He looked at Valdemar, and in his eyes there was no triumph, no revenge, not even pity. There was only a deep and serene understanding of human pain. He did not quote verses, did not preach a sermon. His answer was simple, direct, and laden with the weight of an irrefutable truth. He pointed to his own plants, where a single solitary bee was visiting a pumpkin flower. "You destroyed the home of the workers," he said with his usual gentle voice, "but you could not give orders to the work of the Creator." Those words hung in the air, so simple and so devastating. They contained the entire explanation, all the theology, all the justice of what had happened. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Valdemar understood. He understood that his war had not been against Samuel, but against the very logic of life. He had tried to impose his rules on a system that operated under much older and more powerful laws. Samuel's answer did not offer him comfort, but it gave him the truth. And the truth, at that moment, was all he had. He just nodded his head slowly, turned and went back to his truck, a man who had lost everything, including the arrogance that sustained him. Valdemar's departure was not the end, but the beginning of a new phase in the valley. The image of the broken colonel, seeking answers at the house of the man he had humiliated, sealed the story in the community's collective memory. Divine justice had not come with a thunderclap or a lightning bolt, as some might have expected. It came in the deafening silence of a soybean field without bees, in the slow, agonizing fall of a harvest that was never born. It was a powerful lesson, taught not with words, but with nature itself serving as the blackboard. A man's hubris was confronted by the simple and unshakable logic of creation. Valdemar's ruin was complete. Unable to pay his debts, he was forced to sell much of his land to an agricultural consortium, losing the status and power that had defined his life. He didn't move away, but he shrank. He became a reclusive figure rarely seen, a ghost on his own reduced farm. The authority in his voice disappeared, replaced by a permanent weariness. The man who believed the world bowed to money and force learned the hard way that there are ecosystems and systems of faith that operate with currencies he did not possess. For Samuel, the turn of events also brought changes. The story of his faith and the justice of the bees inspired not only his small church, but the entire region. Neighbors who had once looked at him with pity now saw him with deep respect. Samuel's attitude in the face of tragedy, his prayer of forgiveness amidst the wreckage, became an example of spiritual strength. He did not seek revenge, and yet justice came. This showed everyone that true strength lies not in retaliating, but in entrusting the outcome to God, keeping one's heart clean of hatred. The community, moved by this inspiration, came together in a way Samuel could never have imagined. Led by their church pastor, they organized a work party. Men and women, young and old, showed up at his property with tools, wood, and a genuine will to help. They were not just repairing a loss. They were honoring a man whose faith had strengthened everyone's. In a single weekend, dozens of new hive boxes were built, painted in bright colors, ready to receive new families of bees. It was an act of community restoration, a testament to solidarity. Helena participated in every moment of the work party, her heart filled with an emotion she could hardly name. The anger that had once consumed her had transformed into a deep admiration for her father's wisdom. She painted the new boxes beside him, and the bond between them was stronger than ever. She learned a lesson no school could teach, about the power of forgiveness, the patience of faith, and the certainty that justice, even if silent and slow, always finds its way. She saw with her own eyes how her father's surrender to God had moved heaven and earth. Samuel accepted the help with humility and gratitude. He did not see himself as a hero or a saint. To him, everything that happened was simply the manifestation of God's faithfulness. Seeing his brothers and sisters in faith working together on his land, he felt his heart overflow. The loss he had suffered was immense, but the restoration he was experiencing was even greater. He had not only recovered his beehives, but also the certainty that he was not alone in his journey. God had not only brought him justice against his oppressor, but had also moved the heart of the community to heal his wounds. In time, the buzzing returned to Samuel's property. New colonies of bees were introduced, and they thrived. His little workers once again filled the air with their soft, industrious music. Samuel's fields, pollinated and cared for, produced honey, fruits, and vegetables in abundance. His small land became an oasis of life in a valley that now understood, in a visceral way, the value of those small creatures. His property became a landmark, a place where people went not just to buy honey, but to remember the story and strengthen their own faith. The fall of one man and the rise of another became the new folklore of the region. The story was told and retold, not as gossip but as a testimony. It served as a warning to the arrogant and a comfort to the humiliated. It showed that faith is not an escape from reality, but a way of facing it with a strength that transcends circumstances. Samuel's honor was restored not by a court decision, but by the clear and public demonstration of God's sovereignty over creation. He never saw Valdemar up close again. Sometimes he would see the ex-colonel's old truck pass. In the distance, kicking up less dust than before. There was no feeling of victory in Samuel, only a serene melancholy. He continued to pray for the man, not that he would suffer more, but that he might find some kind of peace. The lesson had been learned by the whole valley, and the price Valdemar paid was far too high. Samuel knew that divine justice is not aimed at our satisfaction, but at the restoration of order and truth. In that valley, the landscape changed, but the memory remained. The Story of Samuel and Colonel Valdemar became a landmark, a turning point. People learned to look at bees not as pests or mere insects, but as agents of a greater power, small essential cogs in the great machine of life. The faith of a calm and resilient black man had taught everyone a fundamental truth about the interconnectedness of all things under God's watch. He became, without ever seeking it, a spiritual patriarch in his community. Years later, Helena, now a young woman, took over part of her father's business. She had his same serenity, but with a fire in her eyes that recalled the girl who once cried out for revenge. She told the story to visitors, to honey buyers, not with anger, but with the authority of one who had witnessed a silent miracle. "My father didn't curse the man, he blessed God," she would say. And God answered, not with fire, but with silence. Sometimes, the greatest miracle is the absence, the proof of what happens when we remove a piece of His creation. Samuel's property flourished as never before. He became an informal consultant to other farmers in the region, teaching about the importance of pollination and a more integrated, respectful agriculture. Men who had once mocked his old-fashioned methods now sought his advice. He did not keep his knowledge to himself. He shared everything he knew, believing that one person's prosperity was everyone's prosperity. His influence grew not through power, but through service. The legacy of that dawn of destruction was not one of bitterness, but of transformation. Samuel's faith, tested in the fire of injustice, emerged purer and stronger. He became a living symbol that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the resilience to endure, forgive, and trust. His story proved that God's justice may not follow our timetable or use our methods, but it is inevitable and, in its wisdom, perfectly instructive. The memory of the harvest that withered to dust was forever etched in that valley. It became a constant reminder that every action has a consequence, and that despising the smallest elements of creation can lead to the ruin of the greatest empires. Colonel Valdemar's arrogance was a high-cost investment that resulted in the bankruptcy of his soul and his fortune. Samuel's faith was a silent investment that yielded dividends of honor, respect, and prosperity. And so, the final lesson echoed through those hills. In that valley, everyone learned that God's justice may not come with the sound of thunder, but with the deafening silence of a flower that refuses to bear fruit without the blessing of his smallest creatures. It was a sermon preached by the earth itself, a testimony that was never forgotten. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.